Deep Trade Agreements. It's a joint webinar series by the Development Economics Research Group and the Macroeconomics Trade and Investments GP. This particular episode is on services trade and state intervention and includes 3 really interesting papers. One on depth of services trade agreements by Ingo Borchert, another rules on public procurement and trade, and the third is containing Chinese by Alen, Mulabdic and Lorenzo Rotunno, and the other containing Chinese state-owned enterprises, the impact of deep state agreements on firm exports by Kevin Lefebvre, Nadia, Rocha, and Michele, Ruta. The last 2 of these are, well, all of these are extremely relevant for what we're doing in MTI. In fact, some of them are being written in collaboration with MTI. And I think this is a great example of bringing research to the relevant questions in policy that we're struggling with. Format will be 20 minutes for each presentation, and then we'll have hopefully questions at the end. Just jump in or flag me and I'll field your question. So why don't we start? Ingo, are you ready? Depth of services trade agreements.
Sure. Thank you very much. Thank you, Bill, and thank you, Michele, Anna, and Nadia for having me on that webinar series. Bill, can you see the shared screen?
Yes.
All right. So as we can see, that's joint work with my colleague Mattia Di Ubaldo, who's also here at Sussex. It's early stages, and so we look forward to your comments. I should gratefully acknowledge a host of very useful comments already received from Peter Egger. So as Bill said, that's week 4, and so we are down into the specific chapters of the trade agreement, and that presentation is going to be about the scope and the effects of services trade agreements. I guess a motivating observation here is that services trade has become ever more important, at least that's what we like to think, partly because of digitization. So services trade is becoming more important in its own right, but also because services is a facilitating driver of all sorts of value chain activities. And there's this curious, roundabout causality of advances in technology and production fragmentation calling out for deep trade agreements or ever deeper trade agreements, and then their existence in turn driving international integration. Probably reflecting these forces, the number of services trade agreements has really taken off after 2000. And so this is the state of play, the number of agreements per country in 2016, after about 2 decades of services PTA proliferation. The most involved countries, Chile, actually, colleagues from LAC will be pleased to know, Chile and Singapore are party to 20 services trade agreements. It's an excellent point in time to take stock, and the new deep trade agreements database by the World Bank is just the tool we need. If I showed you the same picture with the increase in services trade agreements over the 20-year period, it would look exactly the same. And the reason is that in 2000, there was barely nothing, right? Again, Mexico was the only country in the world who was party to 4 services trade agreements, but most other countries, virtually everyone, just had none or 1. And so what you see, the centers of gravity here, North America, Europe, Asia, driven by Japan, China, and Singapore, and in Latin America, Chile and Colombia, there has been really a lot of action over the past 15, 20 years, but it is quite concentrated. And with the exception of China, most of the BRICS, you will notice, is actually absent from that dynamic. And so as a second motivating observation here, this is a simple descriptive scatter plot showing the value of trade per country that is under preferential terms in red and under MFN terms in black. And so you can see, for instance, here, can you see my cursor? Anna, can you give me the thumbs up? Can you see my cursor?
Yes.
Yeah, okay, great. So this is the black dot for Colombia, and this is the red dot for Colombia. So you see that by far the majority of Colombian services trade is under preferential terms, and the same for most other countries. So it's before gravity forces and before self-selection into PTA treatment and all the rest of it. But what I want to flag here is that by now, for most countries, the majority of their services trade is now transacted under preferential terms. And so we ought to be looking into the details of these agreements and understand how they work. And so we've been looking in these initial steps at two things. First, the impact of services PTAs on cross-border services trade. We find significant and economically large effects if we drill down, but it's really important. It's not just the PTA dummy that does the trick. You have to drill down and look out for the ambitious disciplines and provisions. And secondly, we have been looking on the import side and whether PTAs are going to have an effect on the sourcing of the services value added that countries import in order to be embodied in their exports. And again, here we find a small but significant effect that the presence of services PTAs is associated with more services value added being sourced from within the PTA. As Paula famously said 2 weeks ago in her presentation, let me be brief on everything. Without disrespect, there's a lot of literature out there, and that's just paying respect to the colleagues. There's a big literature on FTAs from which we glean two things. One is a kind of a ballpark number from manufacturing FTAs. Baerberg's found 10 years ago that over a decade, an FTA might just about double bilateral trade. Other magnitudes are between 12 and 35% in recent publications by Baer, Yoto, and Zilkin. So that's about the backdrop for benchmarking our results. And also there has been methodological advances recently in terms of fixed effect structure and the way we would like to estimate these kind of things. And we're going to incorporate all of that. So let me get straight into the empirics. First, we study the impact of services PTAs on cross-border services trade. And that's a straight up and down, estimable equation from a structural gravity model, where we have bilateral services trade on the left-hand side. And we'd like to know more about the effect of the term in red, services policies. That can either be a dummy for a services PTA, it could be an individual provision, or probably, what I like most, a cluster of policies that we can think of as ambitious or shallow. And that is conditional on as is now standard as of 2020, full sets of exporter time, importer time, fixed effects, and bilateral fixed effects, which would hopefully take care of most of the self-selection and indigeneity. We do Poisson PML with three-way clustered standard errors, as suggested by Peter Egger and Philip Tollier. In terms of data, we're going to use a just released International Trade and Production database for estimation, from which we pick up the services trade. That confines us to the period 2000 to 2016, which I think is not really restrictive because there wasn't that much action in services PTAs before 2000 anyway. And we're going to look at total services trade, but also specifically finance and insurance, other business services, and IPR charges, which I think are the regulation-intensive services industries or sectors. And of course, the core part, the crown jewel here sort of is the World Bank Deep Trade Agreements database, where over that period we can analyze 131 agreements. And let me give a little bit more background on this. The Deep Trade Agreements database overall codes 143 agreements, of which we will be able to use 131. And we have 8 big policy areas from which we can have information from that database. I'm not going to read it out. Most of it really is, the substance, the most important information on individual provisions comes out of the first 3, which is the structure of the agreement, what kind of modes are covered, are they covered in separate chapters, or is it all lumped together? Scope and coverage is about the liberalization approach. Is it a positive listing approach like in the GATS, or is it a negative scheduling approach? Are subsidies covered? Is government procurement, for instance, excluded or included from the agreement? And then thirdly, there's a whole raft of substantive disciplines covering partly domestic regulation, but also transparency, mandatory publication requirements of regulation and laws, and so on. And so these are the important areas. That's a kind of the texture of the policy information that we can get from the Deep Trade Agreements database. And it is a mixture of the architecture of the agreement and of the depth. One example might be, does the agreement contain obligations not to apply technology transfer requirements? And that's a pretty clear discipline, which is helpful. Other questions are, does the agreement contain provisions on mutual recognition? And the answer is a yes, no. And even if the answer is yes, we might not exactly know what are the disciplines on domestic regulation. But we take it as a proxy for that still being fairly ambitious. So let me get into the empirical results for the first part, and we're going to do this in 3 steps. First, we're going to look at the PTA effect on aggregate services trade. Then we zoom in on specific policy bundles, and then we show that this really works exactly on the regulation-intensive services with sizable effects. And one thing we actually learned with this work is that just sticking in a PTA dummy, won't do the trick. It will become clear, and you see this at the top left-hand side in column 1, that the overall effect of there being a services PTA on bilateral trade is small and not by itself significant. You really have to unpick these deep services trade agreements to actually find out what matters and what doesn't. And if you do this unpicking, which is exactly what the Deep Trade Agreements database allows us to do, and that's why it's such a great and valuable database, then we will be seeing effects that are actually economically quite sizable. Starting from proceeding to column 2, once you unpack the overall PTA effect into bilateral agreements versus plurilateral agreements, then you see that there is a sizable effect of almost 10% if there's a bilateral agreement, and you can trace this all the way back to individual provisions. And overall bilateral services PTA seem to be a bit more ambitious than plurilateral ones. I should say that these are direct partial effects straight out of the gravity equation. Now, that's a beta hat, right? It's not an estimate of a structural parameter or a trade elasticity or something. Or a GE effect. That's something we might want to get at afterwards or develop it into it. This is a direct partial effect. That's quite important. So the language really would be that there being a bilateral PTA is associated with about 10% higher bilateral trade. Columns 3 and 4 are phase-in effects. Clearly, these PTAs take time to trickle down the economy, and 2 years in, bilateral trade is about nearly 20% higher after 2 years. And that's now quite a sizable effect, right? This is very different to the nil effect that you get with a contemporaneous overall effect. What is not shown in that table, just to conserve space, is that you can break out the directional effect of these PTAs. And these PTAs facilitate services trade, especially within middle-income countries by about 5%, and especially so from middle to low-income countries, and from low-income countries to middle-income countries by about 28 and nearly 40%. And these are big numbers. Just very briefly, why? So we see that these effects are driven by bilateral agreements, right? So the question is, why bilateral agreements? And this is just descriptive evidence that breaks out the incidence of individual provisions by bilateral PTAs at the blue bar and plurilateral PTAs, that's a green bar. And there, for instance, you can see that a negative list approach, this bar, is much more prevalent in bilateral PTAs, and we commonly think that a negative list approach is more ambitious than a positive list approach, which is more prevalent in plurilateral agreements. And you can see this whole raft of blue bars to the left of the graph here, where these are all specific substantive disciplines. No local content, no technology transfer requirement, no local content requirement. Is there a standstill clause? Is there a ratchet clause? All this kind of more ambitious stuff tends to be more prevalent in bilateral PTA. So you can trace it all the way back to the texture and the substance of these PTAs. So let me move on to some of these individual provisions, right? Again, the overall PTA effect often is small and therefore not significant. But if there is comprehensive dispute settlement, then that is associated with about 12% higher bilateral services state. Comprehensive dispute settlement means there is state-to-state as well as investor-state dispute settlement available. Same for the ratchet and the standstill clause, meaning there's not going to be no fallback into more restrictive policies. And ratchet clause means whenever a country unilaterally introduces some sort of services trade liberalization, that's going to be automatically part of the agreement. And in each of these cases, it's very interesting to break it out, whether that's in an agreement between countries from the same income bracket, equal, and that could be middle income, need not be too high income countries. That is where the effect is driven, right? These it's associated with higher trade if both of these countries are from the same income bracket. Again, what is not shown, this effect of the US FTA approach to market access is especially trade facilitating, as it were, between low income to high income countries. That's associated with more than 60% more trade. Now, you could say, picking individual provisions, even though interesting, is a bit selective. And so let me move on to consider policy configurations in all of these principal areas that I showed you before. So, for instance, consider the structure of the agreement. Provisions within that realm of structure of the agreement would be the liberalization approach, whether or not there's a ratchet or standstill clause and what is covered. So we define an ambitious policy cluster that would feature all four of these provisions. Is there a negative list approach? Does it have a ratchet and a standstill clause? And is mode 1, mode 3, and mode 4 all legislated in different chapters, in 3 different chapters? And then that's an ambitious approach. The shallow one is obviously everything but that, right? Everything is lumped into one chapter, there's no ratchet clause, and there's a GATS-type positive list approach. And you can do the same for other policy areas as well. Accountability would, for instance, be there is a mandatory appeals authority, there is comprehensive dispute settlement, and there's a mandatory publication requirement for laws and regulations. And shallow is the absence thereof. And now you can run this, and what you find is, and what you should find is, that the trade promoting effect is driven by these ambitious clusters, and that's where the green color is. The absence of a color means it's not an ambitious policy configuration, and that is like a placebo test, right? There is no action where there shouldn't be any action. And I can tell you the most ambitious combinations defined specifically within a policy area are by no means the most frequent ones. All the policy combinations from these individual provisions are included in the estimation. That's important, and that's why it's a lot less selective than including these provisions one by one. But even though all policy combinations are included in the estimation, only the most ambitious ones matter. And here, actually, the magnitudes are quite sizable, right? So key ambitious policy configurations as to the structure of the agreement, rules of origin for investment and the movement of people, or accountability are variously, associated with between 15 and 65% higher values of services trade, and these are sizable numbers. It passes the placebo test, as it were. And that's the last step for cross-border services trade. This is driving it all the way to individual services, sectors, financial services, the host of regulation-intensive other business services, and charters for intellectual property rights, where I think it should matter most, rather than in travel or transport services, which are other quantitatively important items in cross-border services trade. And it's the same kind of, ambitious versus shallow placebo test thing. You see that various, typically you get big and significant effects with the ambitious agreements. For instance, scope 2 would apply if there are mutual recognition of professional qualifications, which explains a big effect for other business services. That's the lawyers, the accountants, and amongst other things, or whether there's a prudential carve-out for financial services, which might partially be behind this effect. So, but again, I should emphasize that on the one hand, these are not general equilibrium effects that you could use in a simulation, although these are just direct gravity effects. On the other hand, it's subject to three-way clustered standard error, so it's very conservative, and I would think it is pretty much a lower bound. Let me switch gears and come to the second kind of question. Let's look not on the exporting side, but let's look on the importing side.
Ingo, 2 minutes, okay?
2 minutes?
Yep.
All right. Wow, you're a tough chair, but okay, that's all right. I guess we all,
Four minutes, Ingo, but
4 minutes. Okay, you're driving hard bargain. Okay. We know what the services value added in a country's exports is. Most of us, I hope, will be familiar with trade and value added. If two countries got a PTA, you might think that PTA enables you, a chorus example here, that if the US has an agreement with Korea, then Koreans' share in services value added supplied to the US might increase. And that's exactly what we find here. Again, it's driven by bilateral agreements mostly. And if you go back to that picture, that could be due. These are shares, right? So everything must sum to 100%. This could come at the expense of other foreign countries who are not part of the PTA, or domestic value added, which would then be true internationalization. We find, but that's early stages, we find preliminary evidence that this is a redirection on the margin of other foreign value added. So let me jump to the conclusions. Otherwise, I'm being told off. This is, if you dig deep enough, and I think that's a good thing, that we find sizable effects on these deep trade agreements where there should be one, and they are economically meaningful. They seem to be especially trade facilitating for services trade amongst middle income countries and to and from middle to low income countries, which I think is very interesting for colleagues at the World Bank. And it seems to work for these financial business and other services where it should work. We also find an effect on the sourcing pattern of services value added that goes into importing countries' exports. And what I find very interesting, I didn't have much time to show this, but these provisions which affect investment and the movement of people, like ownership, what constitutes ownership for judicial firms and for natural firms, that is directly linked to more services value added sourced from PTA partners. So that seems to suggest, at least anecdotally, that these services PTAs do play a larger role in the configuration of value chains, because we find effects that extend beyond cross-border services trade. Next steps for that project would be, we were just about to proceed to agreement-specific effects and trade diversion effects, which I think would be very interesting. And I was very intrigued to dig deeper into differential effects of exclusive versus non-exclusive benefits. That was something that also figured prominently in Meredith Crowley's presentation last week. Some of these services PTA provisions are exclusive. You only recognize professional qualifications from your partner, but not from somebody else, versus a publication requirement for laws and regulations is a public good, and it's difficult to exclude people. And I would like to know more about these exclusive versus non-exclusive benefits. Bigger extensions would be, there clearly is there's a political economy paper to be written on the endogenous architecture of these services PTAs, very clearly, but that's probably a project in its own right. And let me conclude by saying that I'm also involved in a parallel project that is well advanced on quantifying the gap between preferential and MFN policies, and that's joint work between the World Bank and the WTO that would quantify these provisions, of which the Deep Trade Agreements database tells us mostly about the architecture, and that would quantify them in the same way as the World Bank's Services Trade Policy database does. And then we can do a gap analysis. Thanks very much for your attention.
Excellent, Ingo. Thank you very much. Very provocative results. Let's Lorenzo and Alen.
Bill, if you want, you can ask, people can ask some questions.
All right. Are there any questions out there on Ingo's presentation, particularly in areas that I might have cut him off prematurely?
I would have a brief question.
Jump.
Several years ago, Alen Winters and Isidro Zuluaga published a paper in North American Journal of Economics and Finance where they took an extreme approach. I mean, Alen can speak for himself, but they took this extreme approach of estimating basically a parameter on every one trade agreement. And okay, I could see an additional, or perhaps at least as many reasons for doing so here, just by way of a comparison to what you have, as Alen and Isidro at the time had. Because you could say, okay, with goods, on the one hand, you have heterogeneity regarding the tariff level, which, you know, 2 decades ago, we didn't have as good data for. On the other hand, there is interaction between non-tariff bearers and tariff bearers. So the backdrop behind the border as to what regulations are, etc., is less known. And that second point may be particularly interesting in the context of services trade. So what you have here is a rich database regarding bilateral regulations, in a sense that's the substitute for the tariff in bilateral trade for goods. But behind the border, the set of regulations might be interesting to explore in how it interacts with the things that are specified in treaties.
Yes, I completely agree. And that you don't need to go back as far to Winters and Isidro Zuluaga. Tom Zilkin and Jota Jotov has published a paper last year, I think in the EER, where they estimate agreement-specific effects and even directional agreement-specific effects, which I think has a very, very provocative picture in it. It's political dynamite. You see the EEA agreement, which is all the way on the zero line, right? It seems to be pure redistribution. I think this is an area very, very worth going into. I completely agree, and I take your point that there might be interactions with the services provision that we observe here and other behind the border policies that we should think very hard about before we estimate this. I completely take that point. Thank you.
Alen Winters, since I see you're on the line, did you want to add anything or follow up?
Only just to say, well, thank you very much, Peter, for remembering that far back. We had a much smaller group of PTAs to look at. I can't remember quite how many, but certainly, the recent paper by Zilkin and so on, they're very heterogeneous. And to some extent, we've got to recognize that what we're estimating now are real crude averages. And a lot of work to be done, both estimation, but also in sort of more detailed down in the weeds work on a particular agreement, I think.
Okay. Any other thoughts? Or Ingo, did you have a response? No.
I had a question.
Jump.
So Ingo, I thought what you said, I thought the results you had about the different hierarchies was kind of fascinating, but also obviously it's problematic because of endogeneity. And so I was just wondering empirically, is it a case that some of these country pairs deepen their relationship over time? So do we have the same pair first have one level of services commitments that's kind of lousy and then they deepen, or is it really that the variation is mostly cross-sectional here?
Thank you, Meredith. This is a very good question. I haven't looked into it, but it is well worth looking into it. Clearly, what we see is that some countries starting in 2000 have been very, very prolific in engaging in services trade, right? I mean, Chile has signed 20 services trade agreements over that 15-year period. And I would presume that the latest one was deeper than the first one. But it needs to be verified, and we have the data to verify. The paper that I was just alluding to by my friend Yoto and Tom Zilkin and Scott Baer did find that the level of services trade restrictiveness, now they were working on manufacturing, sorry, the level of trade restrictiveness generally, as you go into an agreement, has an effect of, has a bearing on the effect of the agreement. And that's partially to do with terms of trade effects and your willingness to make concessions in a trade agreement that might not necessarily be present in services trade agreements. But I would be very intrigued to just start your line of inquiry by including as a crude proxy the number of services trade agreements that a country is already party to when it concludes the N+1 agreement, and see what kind of heterogeneity comes out of that. I think that's an excellent idea. Yes, thank you.
Okay, I think we should move on. But thanks very much. Excellent questions. Lorenzo. Yes, I can see it. I can see it, but I can't hear you, Lorenzo.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, sir.
Okay, great. So, and you can see the slides.
Yeah. Not right now. I can't. I'm seeing you.
Wait a second, then. Sorry.
I don't know.
Now, yes.
Yes. Yes.
Oh, let's try this again.
Can you make it bigger?
Yeah.
Perfect.
I should be. Right. So thanks a lot for being here, and thanks. Let me thank also the organizers of this great seminar series for giving me the opportunity to present this joint work with Alen Mulabdic on trade barriers in government procurement. So this is preliminary work, which is also part of a joint project between the trade unit and the global procurement unit at the World Bank. So what we try to do in this paper is very simple. We try to assess the importance of trade barriers in government procurement, and then we want to identify the partial effects of trade agreements, of trade policy in partially reducing these trade barriers. So government procurement is a major market, something that we should care about. It accounts for 12% of world GDP. We also know that for different reasons, often political, economic, or political economy reasons, public authorities tend to limit participation by foreign suppliers in government procurement markets. Just think about the number of binational provisions that governments often include in fiscal packages. So here, for instance, in this figure, we use data from the Global Trade Alert database, which tracks protectionist policies from the global financial crisis basically up to today. And we look at discriminatory policies in public procurement. So on the left-hand side, you have the number of country pairs that in every year is involved in a new discriminatory policy. With the exception of this interesting drop in 2017, you can see that the number is always around 2,000 and 3,000, which means that, given the number of possible country pair in the world, every year a country has a 10% chance of introducing a new discriminatory policy in public procurement vis-a-vis another country in the world. Okay, so that's just to tell you that protectionist policies in government procurement are quite widespread. At the same time, governments have committed to greater access to procurement markets through both deep trade agreements and participation in the renewed WTO government procurement agreement. So here in this figure, we look at deep trade agreements using data from the new deep trade agreement database. And so the orange line and orange bars look at the evolution of the number of trade agreements without provisions on government procurement, whereas the blue line and bars look at the evolution of trade agreements that include enforceable provisions in government procurement. We all know that there has been a proliferation of free trade agreements starting in the early 90s. But what you can also see here is that there is kind of a roughly parallel trend, an increase in the number of trade agreements that have enforceable provisions in government procurement. Nowadays, we count that almost a quarter of trade agreements have such provisions. Okay, so against this kind of contradicting, at least partly, policy background, on one hand, you have an enduring protectionism in government procurement. On the other hand, you have increasing participation in deep trade agreements that have procurement provisions. In this paper, we try to kind of quantify or estimate trade barriers in government procurement. We look at two objects, the border effect and an index of home bias, that are estimated applying standard gravity model to data from inter-country input-output tables, which we need in this application, and we use to proxy for government procurement flows. We have data for 62 countries between 1995 and 2015. In doing this exercise, we will assess the role of deep trade agreements, and in particular, some specific provisions of these trade agreements in reducing these trade barriers. Okay. So the empirical strategy is straightforward. Like, it's very similar to the standard gravity model that, for instance, Ingo also used in his analysis. Here, the main, if you want, the main thing that we have is that we're going to distinguish between two buying, what we call buying markets, which are denoted by the subscript superscript K in these equations. There will be a public market, which is basically the government procurement market, and the private market, which includes all private-to-private transactions. We can make this distinction conceptually in a gravity framework as long as we assume that for each firm will sell differentiated varieties of a given product to governments versus other differentiated varieties to other firms. So there is kind of this segmentation, if you want, between the two markets, okay? We're gonna go one step further, and we're gonna also distinguish between goods and services. We do that for a specific reason. If you look at the descriptive data, like we do here, you quickly realize that the bulk of government procurement is in services. So here we have the service share of purchases in public and private markets. So this is the green for public procurement and orange for private markets. And you can see that roughly 90% of government procurement in our data is services. The same share for private markets is no more than 60%. Okay, so we are gonna have also distinction by sector S, goods and services. And then, the gravity equation is the standard one. Exports from country I to country J will be a function of total expenditure in the importing country, total revenues in the exporting country, the bilateral cost factor, this TIJ, and the multilateral resistance terms, which themselves are functions of bilateral trade costs around the world. We will use this structural gravity model to define an index of constructed home bias, which is taken from the work of Anderson and Yoto. Here, the idea is very simple. Home bias basically measures how much a country trades with itself relative, so given the structure of trade costs around the world, relative to what we would observe in a frictionless world. The structure tells us that in a frictionless world, internal trade should just be a function of home expenditure and home revenues in a given sector and a given market. And so basically, this home bias index tells us how much trade costs around the world bids up internal trade relative to what we would observe without trade costs. We're going to use the predicted values from the gravity equations, rescale them in order to get an estimate of these home bias indexes. So the empirical specification we use of the gravity equation is pretty standard. So we'll use the Poisson maximum likelihood estimator, and then we will have these M and E terms, which are importer and exporter fixed effects to absorb the role of multilateral resistance terms. And then we will have this trade cost factor, the bilateral trade cost factor IJ, that is going to be modeled in two ways. First step, we'll just throw in the kind of usual suspects, time invariant bilateral trade cost shifters, distance, common colonial history, and so on and so forth, and trade agreements variables. Of all these variables, we're going to focus on the same country dummy, equal to 1 for internal trade, because this will give us an indication of the border effect. Okay, how much countries trade more with themselves once we control for other trade frictions and multilateral resistance terms. And more specifically, we want to see whether the content of trade agreements can explain this border effect. We're going to also test for some political economy factors that can explain it. In a second step, we will add to the specification bilateral fixed effects to estimate the partial effect of trade agreements and their provision. As Ingo said, also here, this is not going to be a general equilibrium effect. It's just going to be the coefficient on different trade agreements dummies, so a partial equilibrium effect. How do we measure government procurement? So let's go to the data. We follow the kind of institutional definitions. We're going to define, following the OECD, government procurement as the sum of intermediate consumption, gross fixed capital formation, and social transfers in kind via market producers. So how to translate this empirically? We're going to follow a recent report by European Commission, which also uses input-output tables to proxy for government procurement flows. So the sum of public administration, health, and education output columns in the input-output table is a proxy for intermediate consumption. And the general government expenditure column is going to be measuring social transfers in kind via market producers. Okay. Of course, one limitation that we have here is that we don't have in the input-output tables a distinction between public and private gross fixed capital formation. So we are missing that term. We will also check the robustness of our results with respect to a more, what we refer as to narrow definition, where health and education will be treated as the private market. In our baseline definition, the private market, which here acts as a kind of as a control group, if you want, will sum all other output columns in the input-output table and also households' final demand. Okay, so we're going to estimate these gravity equations for government and private markets, and we're going to look at the difference in the estimates across these two markets. Okay, so we use the inter-country input-output table from the trading value-added database from the OECD in order to measure this component of the input-output tables, and we can obtain therefore some estimated bilateral flows in government and private markets between 62 countries. Almost half of them are EU members, then there are other OECDs and a bunch of developing economies, between 1995 and 2015. To purge out kind of measurement error that can come from yearly variation in the data, we're going to use this data in 4-year intervals. The other building block of our data comes from the recent Deep Trade Agreement database, which gives us information on provisions in government procurement included in a trade agreement. So we use the data that they provide, and after cleaning, we can identify 39 provisions on government procurement. They are classified in broad families. We're going to use this data in two ways. First, we're going to just use a standard bilateral indicators for the presence of these provisions in a trade agreement. And then we're going to isolate those provisions that are typically unilateral. These are provisions on transparency and provisions on procedural disciplines. So example is, can the potential supplier use e-procurement methods to participate in government procurement auctions? Or does the agreement contain obligations to publish statistics on government procurement on the websites? So these are unilateral provisions in the sense that it is very difficult / impossible to exclude non-member countries from benefiting from these provisions, okay? And then the other variables are from standard sources. So let's jump into the results. First, the specification without bilateral fixed effects. So here again, we will have a host of bilateral trade cost shifters. I won't report their estimates. What I want to focus is on the same country dummy. And you can see that we will have always government and private markets. For each specification, we will report both estimates. And the coefficients in bolds are those coefficients that are whose estimates are statistically different across the government and private markets. Okay, so this is for goods, and what you can see from the first row is that there seems to be indeed a stronger border effect in government than in private markets. The difference is not that large, but it is statistically significant, especially when we introduce interactions of these same country dummies with the potential factors explaining the border effect. Okay, so here we focus on unilateral provisions of the trade agreement. First, we just take the max of the share of total provisions in government procurement that are covered by an agreement. So we take the maximum for each country here. Okay, so as a rough measure of unilateral liberalization. A more precise measure comes when we take the share only among provisions that are classified as unilateral. You can see here, when it comes to goods, there's not much going on, meaning that these unilateral provisions do not seem to reduce the border effect. When it comes to services, the picture is quite different. First of all, we observe that in services, the borders are much thicker, significantly thicker in government than in private markets. And this is more so than in goods, okay? Remember, we know that governments spend disproportionately more on services, okay? We also find that this border effect, if you look at column 3 and column 5, gets significantly thinner when the country joins a trade agreement with higher unilateral depth, okay? So just to give you an idea, these estimates imply that participation in deep trade agreements covering many unilateral provisions makes the public border effect in services up to 10% lower. We also find tests for the role of corruption and other political economy factors, and we do not find any distinctive role of those variables in affecting the border effect. And this might be also just because in the sample of countries that we have, which is mainly OECD countries, there's not a lot of variation in these institutional factors. In the second part of the analysis, we look at the effects of bilateral trade policies, okay? And so here we have bilateral fixed effects, so we look at within country pair variations. We need to be careful here because countries can join trade agreements that are deep, that have enforceable provisions on procurement, but at the same time, they can be part of the WTO GPA and they can be EU members, okay? So we're gonna add all these variables step by step. When we look at goods, again, for goods, the results are not very strong, in the sense that we do find a trade-creating effect of trade agreements. But first of all, this trade-creating effects is not different, or is not larger. If anything, is smaller for trade agreements with procurement provisions, and also is not systematically larger in government than in private markets. Whereas when we look at services, you can see all coefficients here are in bold, meaning that there is a significant difference across government and private markets. Importantly, we find that, of course, these are relative effects, right? You can think about this as percent effects. And you can see that the effect is much larger for government procurement than for private markets. Interestingly, looking at column 3, this effect is mainly driven by agreements with procurement provisions. Also, going from column 3 to column 5 and 7, you realize that half of this effect is driven by participation in the WTO government procurement agreement and the EU membership. This is not surprising. So we looked at this, some of the text of some of these deep trade agreements with the procurement chapters, and many of the articles are basically copy-pasted by the WTO GPA. So from the WTO GPA. So it's not surprising that part of the effect is driven by membership in the WTO GPA, which is, the effect of WTO GPA membership is quite large. Of course, it's also not surprising that the EU membership increases relatively a lot cross-border government procurement, if you consider that within our sample, the EU is definitely the deepest trade agreement. So if you take our estimates, they suggest that entering a trade agreement with provisions on government procurement boosts cross-border flows by 77%, which is quite large, but half of this effect seems to be due by WTO GPA and EU memberships. We also estimate the effects of single provisions. Here, after having seen the presentations in the first week by Tom, we realized that the way we do it is pretty naive and rough. So we are happy to incorporate their methodology, which is definitely more robust than the way we do. But so what our estimates suggest is that the largest effects is actually given by these provisions that are classified as unilateral. And to confirm these results, these are new estimates.
Just one minute, right, Lorenzo?
Yeah. So we find when we, in the bilateral fixed effects regression, we interact the same country dummy with unilateral debt, especially in services, we find that, again, unilateral debt decreases the border effect, but more importantly, there is no effect of the bilateral dummy, suggesting that indeed, these unilateral provisions drive most of the trade-creating effect of these trade agreements. Finally, a few words, we look at these estimated on-bias indexes. We find that government procurement is 50% higher than in private markets. This difference is driven by two elements. First, governments are more unbiased in both service and goods sectors, especially in service sectors. This comes from we know this also from the border effect estimates, but also there is a composition effect. Governments spend relatively more in aggregate sectors that are more unbiased, and this drives up government unbias at the country level. So I'm running out of time, so let me conclude. What we find in this paper is that, perhaps not surprisingly, governments are indeed strongly unbiased. But strongly here, we qualify strongly by comparing government border effect and home bias to the benchmark, which is in home bias and border effect in the kind of private transactions. Okay. We also find evidence suggesting that deep trade agreements, especially their unilateral provisions, have been successful in at least partially reducing barriers to government procurement. And finally, I think what we observe in these results is that there is an interesting implications for trade negotiations. We know government procurement is mainly about services, and we find that it is in services that governments are particularly unbiased, okay, or seems to be relatively more unbiased. And so this calls for greater integration between trade negotiations on services and government procurement. if you want to liberalize government procurement, perhaps it is really important to be serious about liberalizing trading services. We have, I mean, this is all preliminary. We have a lot of stuff that we could do to improve the work, but I stop here, and I would rather take questions and comments from the audience.
Great, fantastic. Okay, we have about 4 minutes for questions. Peter Egger, you had a comment that was followed up on by Mario Larch. Did you want to say something there? I guess, are you still on, Peter? I guess not. Anyway, he says the constructed home, go ahead.
I'm looking at it now, yeah. And see it.
I mean, if you want, I could because I followed up Mario Lach here, may share my video. I think what Peter meant is in the constructed home bias, you have a benchmark that you use, which is frictionless trade. And here, basically, the assumption is that income and expenditures or outputs are constant in the two scenarios that you explained, the trade cost scenario and the frictionless trade scenario. So you don't get this part with the constructed home bias. In order to be able to capture that, you would have to go the full GE route. I guess this was that is, and I agree with this.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Mario. Thanks a lot, Peter. Yeah, that's true. We say that it's it's kind of a conditional analysis, right? It's conditional expenditure and revenues being fixed. It is true that, I mean, cross-border government procurement is very small, right? I mean, relative to overall government procurement. And so, we can do that, like the full GE analysis. I wouldn't expect these, the changes, especially when it comes to government procurement, to be pretty large. But anyway, we can definitely take that into account. Thanks a lot.
Any other thoughts? Last comments, Lorenzo, or are we good?
There's
a comment, Bill, on the chat.
Yeah, there is.
Okay. Could you say something more on the data? Does TIVA distinguish between procured and regular trade, or are you merely assuming that in some sectors all flows must be procurement?
Yeah, it's more so. Thanks a lot,
Joe.
So thanks a lot for the question, Joe. So it's more the second, meaning that we basically follow what some other, I mean, especially some government reports, but also other people have done. We basically assume that if you take, the output column in an input-output table, the output column for public administration, health, and education, that's basically the government sector. Okay. We also replicate all the results by assuming that health and education is private markets. Of course, you might well assume that there will be sectors in some countries like, utilities, transport services that are largely public or even fully public. And that, that will go against finding any significant differences between the public and the private markets.
So a follow-up question would then be that what you describe as thicker borders for procurement might also just be thicker borders for the type of services which government tends to buy, maybe because they're less codified or less standardized. That would be a similar interpretation.
Yeah, I agree with you. And this goes in line with our conceptual framework, because you can separate out the public and private markets in the gravity if you assume that firms somehow they can segment the two markets. They can sell variety of a given service and goods to public authorities and another variety of a given service and good to private firms. So yeah, it goes in line with your reading in a way.
All right, thanks.
May I just add one thing? Actually, what we do observe, at least for final demand, we distinguish between government expenditure, final demand, and private sector demand. So that we observe in the TIVA data. What we don't observe is in terms of intermediates, the distinction between public and private buyers.
Great. Okay, let's move on. We have one last paper by Kevin Lefebvre, Nadia Rocha, and Michele Ruta. Why don't you go ahead?
Okay, could you see the slide?
Yes, yes, we can.
Okay, perfect. Okay, so good morning and good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for having me today. So today we'll talk about the spillovers of enforcing state-owned enterprises rules between third countries. So this paper is entitled Containing Chinese State-owned Enterprises, the Role of Deep Trade Agreements on Firms' Exports. And this is a joint project with Nadia and Michele. So as motivation, I'll say that the rapid rise of China has been unexpected. And this phenomenon, coupled together with the uniqueness of the economic structure of China, has been largely unforeseen by the multilateral trading rules. Those Chinese characteristics include notably the non-negligible presence of the state in the economy, as well as the management of state-owned enterprises that receive either explicit or implicit support from the government. So as a result, those key specificities of the Chinese economy fall outside the scope of the current jurisdiction of the World Trade Organization, WTO, and not surprisingly, issues concerning state-owned enterprises, but state intervention more globally emerge as point of tension for the WTO system. Again, this background, countries began to regulate the anti-competitive behavior of state-owned enterprises through regional trade agreements. And nowadays, around 70% of those agreements include some forms of SOE regulation. This led some scholars to argue that bilateralism could actually be a path to deal with the challenges posed by the rise of China. And a good example can be found in the Trans-Pacific Partnership, the TPP, where Mark Wu, in his article, The China Inc., go even beyond by saying that Trans-Pacific partnerships serve as a building block for developing new trade rules. China will then need to choose whether to embrace these rules eventually or risk the displacement from the new preferential trade arrangement. So not only signing trade agreements with China that include state-owned enterprises regulation could be a solution, but signing trade agreements with third countries that enforce state-owned enterprises rule can help to define new rules that China will have to comply with in the future. So not only there is a direct impact of those provisions, but there is also some spillovers. And this paper is basically about the spillovers. So despite this rich policy debate, what is missing here is empirical evidence. So in this paper, we answer the following question. If the WTO rules are unable to deal with Chinese characteristics, are regional trade agreements an alternative way to address those issues? So in other words, is the solution in bilateralism rather than multilateralism when it comes to regulate state-owned enterprises? So this is raising the question about the direct impact of those state-owned enterprises. How do regional trade agreements rule on state-owned enterprises enforced by China affect Chinese state-owned enterprises? This question is very difficult to assess because China doesn't have so much trade agreements, and when it does, it rarely includes binding state-owned enterprises provisions. And as a matter of fact, most of those agreements that include state-owned enterprises provision are signed between third countries, letting some room for spillovers. So in this paper, the main question the question on which we focus on is how do regional trade agreements on state-owned enterprises enforced between third countries affect Chinese flows, Chinese performances, and more particularly Chinese state-owned enterprises performances. Okay, so to motivate further our research question, here we take a preliminary look at the data and using the universe of the regional trade agreements that are in our database, and we plot the median of the index of Chinese exports to all the members of regional trade agreements that exclude China before and after the entry in force of the agreement. And basically, we disentangle between agreements that include those enforceable state-owned enterprises provisions and those that exclude them. And what we see is that Chinese export increase relatively more in those markets that do enforce state-owned enterprises provisions. So this differential impact is the heart of our study. So why should we expect this relative increase of Chinese export to those markets? Here are some theoretical mechanisms that we have in mind to explain this. So if you assume a regional trade agreement that excludes China and regulates state-owned enterprises, those provisions on state-owned enterprises will decrease the government support to their domestic state-owned enterprises and reduce their competitiveness. So at the extensive margin, the productivity threshold above which Chinese firms are able to access those markets will decrease, and this will trigger the entry of the less productive Chinese firms in this market. And because in China, state-owned enterprises are on average less productive than the private firms, this could actually benefit relatively more to state-owned enterprises rather than private firms. And when we go to the intensive margin, if you make the assumption that in some sectors, domestic state-owned enterprises are competing with foreign Chinese state-owned enterprises, already established Chinese state-owned enterprises may actually gain some market share, may actually expand their market share in those markets where state-owned enterprises have lost some competitiveness. Okay, so what these papers do, we find that when third countries are enforcing state-owned enterprises regulation between them, this leads to an increase in Chinese export as compared to the export of the rest of the world. And we find that this relative export of China compared to the rest of the world is actually driven by the entry of Chinese state-owned enterprises as compared to private firms. So our contribution to the literature are the following. So most of the literature on the performances of Chinese state-owned enterprises have focused on internal factors, domestic factors such as the reform of state-owned enterprises. Here we contribute to this literature by shedding some light on the external factors that affect the performances of Chinese state-owned enterprises, namely the trade agreements that are signed between third countries. We also contribute to the literature analyzing the spillovers of regional trade agreements, and here by providing here some evidence of spillover effect across countries that is specific to state-owned enterprises regulation in regional trade agreements. So just to a few words about the literature. So our paper relates to 3 different literature. First, the literature that studies the performances of Chinese state-owned enterprises. Our paper relates also to this literature analyzing the spillovers of deep trade agreements. And finally, we also relate to a more legal literature that shows that state-owned enterprises regulation in regional trade agreement is going beyond the scope of the WTO jurisdiction. So to investigate the spillover effect of enforcing state-owned enterprises regulation between third countries, we merge 3 different types of data. So first, we use the deep trade agreement database that is constructed by the World Bank. And in this database, we focus on the chapter on state-owned enterprises provisions that is coded by Rubini and Wang. We merge this database with bilateral trade data at the country level, so using BASI, between 1995 and 2015. And finally, in order to have some estimation at the firm level, we are using the universe of Chinese custom transaction between 2000 and 2011. So those data are aggregated at the firm destination and time level. In those data, we are mainly interested in the value exported by each firm, and we can differentiate between those firms that are state-owned enterprises versus those that are private firms. Okay, so we already know that trade agreements are going deeper and deeper over time. And this is also true for the chapter on state-owned enterprises in regional trade agreements. Here we plot the number of new regional trade agreements that are signed each year. And we disentangle between those that have a low, medium, or high depth of state-owned enterprises regulation. And what we do see is that there is an increase of those agreements that sign a high number of provision in state-owned enterprises, concerning state-owned enterprises. But we also, what is also interesting to see here is that there is some variation over time and within each year. And this variation will be very useful to identify our spillover effect. Okay, so the provision on state-owned enterprises globally aim at prohibiting the anti-competitive behavior of state-owned enterprises and providing a level playing field. So while some of those regulations may actually be already present in the WTO jurisdiction, there is a lot that actually go beyond the scope of the WTO. And here, basically, there is a number of selected provisions that we have in our database, and that are regulating state-owned enterprises. And in bold, you have those provisions that are regulating ownership, that are regulating the discrimination by state enterprise, that are regulating also subsidies and the anti-competitive behavior of state-owned enterprises. And those 4 different provisions have been flagged by the coder, by the author of the database as key. So we'll also look at those specific provisions. So to further motivate our paper, we've done the exercise at the country level, where we estimate the direct and indirect impact of regional trade agreements, and more specifically of state-owned enterprises regulation, using 188 countries between 1995 and 2015. So here we explain the export value of a country I to a destination J at time T. Our first line basically include the standard gravity fixed effect. Our second line captures the direct impact of regional trade agreements, and our third line capture the spillover effect of regional trade agreements. So the variable in black are disentangling the contribution of the depths of state-owned enterprises compared to the depths of other chapter in gray. So basically, the bilateral state-owned enterprises provision variable is capturing the total number of SOE provision that are in force between country I and country J at time T. And the multilateral SOE provision variable is the cumulated number of state-owned enterprises provision signed by country J with all its trade partner except country I at time T. And this capture basically the spillovers of SOE regulation in third markets. And because our our JT fixed effect is absorbing the average impact of these spillovers, we interact our spillover variable with a dummy, which is equal to 1 when China is an exporter. So what we capture is actually the spillover effect of state-owned enterprises regulation in certain markets affecting Chinese export relative to the rest of the world. So and here are the results. So we estimate this using the PPML, and we have 4 different columns. So in the first column, we use the total number of state-owned enterprises provision. In the second column, we use only those that are enforceable. In the third column, we use those that are enforceable and going beyond the scope of the WTO. And finally, in the last column, we use those that are flagged as key by the authors. So focusing on the two main variables of interest, bilateral depth of state-owned enterprises is never significant in those specifications, meaning that regulating state-owned enterprises provision in a regional trade agreements will not affect the trade activity between members. However, when it comes to multilateral depth of state-owned enterprises provision, this is positive and significant in all the specification, meaning that enforcing state-owned enterprises provision between third countries will actually increase the export of China to those markets relatively more to the export of the rest of the world. And right now we want to dive into this impact and we want to see which kind of firms are driving this increase. Is it because of state-owned enterprises or because of Chinese private firms? So this is what we bring our empirical specification at the firm level. So here we explain both the export participation, the extensive margin of Chinese firms, as well as the exported value, the intensive margin. And we do this by by changing the fixed effect structure. So right now we have a firm destination specific fixed effect, which is identifying the impact along the panel dimension over time, before and after the regional trade agreements. We have this firm time specific fixed effect, which identify the impact across countries. And finally, we have this JT fixed effect, which account for the variation of the demand. What we do right now is to interact all our variable of interest with a dummy variable which is equal to 1 firm status when the firm is a state-owned enterprises, meaning that what we are looking at is a differentiated impact on state-owned enterprises as compared to private firms. Okay, so here are the results. So the first 4 columns are looking at the participation, while the 4 last columns are investigating the intensive margin. When we look at the bilateral depths of state-owned enterprises, what we do see is that signing a trade agreement with China enforcing state-owned enterprises provision will reduce the participation of Chinese firms, but will not affect their performances at the intensive margin. Sorry. Just here a few words to say that since China doesn't have so much state-owned enterprises provision, this should be taken with a piece of salt. And what I will focus on is maybe the multilateral depths of state-owned enterprises variable, which show positive and significant estimates for both the participation and the level of export, meaning that when third countries are enforcing state-owned enterprises provisions, this will increase the participation as well as the level of export of state-owned enterprises, of Chinese state-owned enterprises, relatively more as compared to the performances of private firms. And this is our benchmark results. So after that, we did several robustness check and some extensions. So what we did is that we wanted to differentiate this impact across different sectors. And basically what we find here is that the impact of at the extensive margin is present in all the sectors. However, the impact at the intensive margin is present in a very limited number of sectors. And in that sense, we also look for we disentangle the contribution of the extensive margin with respect to the contribution of the intensive margin, and we find that this impact that is actually driven by the entry, is actually driven by the extensive margin at 90%. Finally, because also state-owned enterprises can be regulated in the chapter on subsidies or on competition in those regional trade agreements, we include those two different chapters. And what we do see is that when we include those, our results are even stronger. Okay, so I think I'm running out of time, so I will just conclude by saying that in this paper, we find that rather than containing Chinese state-owned enterprises, the rules on state-owned enterprises in regional trade agreements signed by third countries are actually increasing the export of Chinese firms. And this is actually driven by the entry of Chinese state-owned enterprises. And finally, I would say that this finding point to the need to have commonly agreed multilateral rules to regulate state-owned enterprises. So thank you very much, and I'm looking for your comments.
Great, Kevin. Thanks very much. Ingo, you had a question?
Thanks, Bill. The first one was just a clarification question, really. I mean, Kevin went very fast, but I seem to understand that a state-owned enterprise is registered as such if it has 70% of the state. Now, that seems really high. I think majority-owned enterprise sometimes is 50% or even down to 10%. And we're not even talking about backroom sort of conversations by which the state could exert its influence. And the other question was, I thought the big issue with the state-owned sector in China is about all sorts of subsidies. So what about not only state-owned enterprises, but also state-owned banks? Do you have reason to believe that there are that subsidies potentially channeled through state-owned banks are partly at play in your results? Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Ingo, for your question. Do you hear me? Yeah. Okay. So yeah, it's true that we have this limitation in the data where at least to be classified. I mean, in the data to be classified as a state-owned enterprises, it is mandatory for those firms to classify as state-owned enterprises if they have more than 70% of the capital that is held by a public entity. So meaning that we capture probably a smaller share of state-owned enterprises that what is in reality. But still our result all for this the let's say lower bound of state-owned enterprises. And the second question was about, sorry, I just forgot the second question.
Well,
Go ahead, Ingo.
It was about the role of subsidies, really. I mean,
yeah. No,
it's not relevant, but.
I think it's relevant because the subsidies are very important in the debate of the state-owned enterprises, and this is why actually we have some results here where we include the rules on state-owned on subsidies and competitions here, and basically what we find is that our results are even stronger when we include both subsidies and competition. So those coefficients are strong, positive, and that they add up actually to the state-owned enterprises provisions.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Any other questions, comments, suggestions? Jump in.
Hi, Bill. This is Ana Cusolito. I have a couple of questions.
Ana, go.
Yes. So first of all, I mean, I like this paper very much. I think that it has a very powerful idea. So congratulations to the team for doing that. Maybe my main concerns are sort of related to the identification strategy. Are you really actually capturing the mechanism that you claim in the paper and this spillover effect? And I want to sort of give you a couple of thoughts that came to my mind when actually I was reading the paper. So first, it's like bilateral flows at the country level confound many things. So it's really very hard to identify the proposed mechanism. Are you capturing the effect of market competition, or is it just a reflection of the upstream channel? Because it could happen that domestic SOEs that now become less competitive basically start actually importing intermediate inputs from China. The other thing is that given that Chinese SOEs have been investing largely abroad as foreign investors, and that SOE provisions embedded in trade agreements also apply to foreign SOEs, is basically increased export flows coming from China a reflection of increased import penetration, or in terms of, creation of new export activity, or this is just a reallocation from foreign investment to arm's length trade, as Chinese SOEs located in member countries are sort of reshored to avoid being subject to the SOE provisions. And I am saying this because in the database that I am creating, I see a lot of Chinese SOEs with present in foreign countries. And the other thing, the other concern that I have is, and I am not an expert on trade agreements, but it's sort of, I was sort of surprised that in both of the specifications that you propose to identify the spillover effect, the product specificities embedded in the trade agreements are sort of ignored, because it's like you are using basically exploring and exploiting only the cross-country variations. So while RTR's provisions like the ones on SOEs, IPRs, and competition policy have a broad application, most of the trade agreements refers to a specific product level concessions that member countries make. So I think that in order to really identify the effect, I think that it would have been much better to have like a one-to-one mapping between the basically bilateral trade flows at the product level and the product specificities embedded in the trade agreements. And the last comment that I have is that it's hard to believe that you don't have endogeneity problems when thinking about the political economy of signing trade agreements. If you move from a partial equilibrium approach to a more general equilibrium approach, I think that it's hard to be convinced that the decision of joining an agreement is totally orthogonal to the present or the bilateral flows, export flows coming from China. So I have thinking, about many of these, how actually the team can sort of cope with these identification concerns. This is something that Michele and the team kindly asked me to do that, because I'm working on sort of related topics, and I am happy actually to talk to you guys after basically this seminar and actually brainstorming a little bit more. But congrats, because I think that it's a great paper with a very powerful policy implication.
Okay, thank you very much, Anna, for the comments. I'll just answer briefly on the mechanism. So it's true that we miss a proper identification because and I think I'll have two answers for that. So the first one is that we miss this sectoral dimension, let's say, where, for example, state-owned enterprises are located in third countries. Because if, according to our mechanism, this impact should be greater in those markets where state-owned enterprises are largely dominant in foreign countries, in third countries. So if we are able to show that this is the case, this will be very useful. And my second point maybe is also that usually in those countries where you have a lot of state-owned enterprises, one issue is also that state-owned enterprises are also giving subsidies to other firms, meaning that it could be also tricky at some point to identify clearly where those benefits are in which sectors. Because if you provide electricity, I don't know, to all the firms, it will apply to all the sectors, I think, but this is also something we need to think about. And the endogeneity, I fully agree that like when we look at the direct impact of the state-owned enterprises provision in trade agreements, there should be some endogeneity, and this is also probably why China doesn't sign so much of those state-owned enterprises provisions. However, when we look at the spillovers, meaning that we are looking at how Chinese state-owned enterprises react when third countries are signing together provision on state-owned enterprises. This, I think, could be less endogenous, and I mean, this is our strategy for the paper. But thanks for all the comments.
Okay. We have 2 more questions, but we're also at 11:30, so maybe you can take those offline from Majid and from Sonia. And I'll just say to the audience, thank you very much for being here, and thanks to the authors for 3 excellent papers. Just to let you know, the next seminar is November 24th at 10 o'clock, non-trade issues in trade agreements. So please come back and join us. Thanks.
Thank you, Bill. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.